Imagine sitting in your living room in the late 1940s. The heavy fringed curtains are drawn tight against the night. The main lights are completely off.
Right, the only illumination in the entire room is that warm, amber glow, just the light emanating from the dial of a massive wooden console radio in the corner.
Exactly. And the vacuum tubes inside are humming. You can almost feel that faint metallic heat radiating from it. And out of the static, cutting through the miles of darkness straight into your home, comes a voice.
A very specific kind of voice. It's quiet. It has a slight, almost elegant lisp to it.
Yeah, it is incredibly polite.
Yeah.
And, well, it is utterly terrifying.
Because it is the voice of a man who is inviting you into the shadows. He's not dragging you. He's just, politely holding the door open, waiting for you to step inside.
Which sets the perfect mood for us. You're listening to Chesterton Radio tonight. We are broadcasting to you from our warm, dimly lit studio right here in Atchison, Kansas.
And if you sit quietly, you might actually be able to hear the Kansas wind howling outside the glass tonight. It's sweeping down from the north, just rattling the panes.
There's distant thunder rolling across the plains, too. But inside here, the late-night lamps are glowing. The coffee in the pot is strong and black. So if you're awake with us, settle in. Pull up a chair.
Because tonight, we are unpacking the beautiful, really lonely art of midnight storytelling.
We are talking about the thrill of discovering forbidden old broadcasts long after the rest of the world has gone to sleep. The crackle of those old transcription discs, the invisible waves bouncing off radio towers in the dark.
And the haunting survival of voices that have somehow managed to transcend time itself. It really is, it's a form of time travel.
It really is. When you listen to these archival recordings, we are reaching back 70, 80 years into the past.
And the subject of our deep dive tonight is a man whose name became universally synonymous with the monstrous. But his actual life and his artistry were filled with this unexpected, almost heartbreaking light.
We are looking at the true artistry of Boris Karloff.
Which is such a massive topic.
Oh, absolutely. And our mission here isn't just to rehash the standard Hollywood lore.
No.
I mean, we all know the iconic square-headed silhouette of Frankenstein's monster, right? With the bolts in the neck.
Yeah, that image is permanently burned into the global consciousness.
But what we want to uncover tonight is his unparalleled, deeply human legacy as one of the great voices and personalities of old-time radio. Because to really understand the magic of Karloff, you have to realize that his true power wasn't visual.
No, not at all. His true power lay entirely in his voice.
Exactly. And that is the ultimate paradox of his career, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. I mean, he is remembered for a movie role where he didn't speak a single word of English. It was just grunts and growls beneath pounds of grease paint and collodion.
Right, the Jack Pierce makeup.
Yeah. Yet, armed with nothing more than a microphone and echo chamber and this profound emotional intelligence, he could conjure up foggy London streets or towering Gothic cathedrals.
Dusty, forgotten theaters.
Exactly. And the darkest, most claustrophobic corners of the human psyche, all just with sound.
But to understand the stories he told, we really have to start with the storyteller himself. Like, who was Boris Karloff, really?
Because the biographical records from the era paint a picture of a man that is so completely at odds with his terrifying public persona.
Completely. He wasn't born a Hollywood monster, obviously.
Right.
Or even an Eastern European aristocrat, which the name Boris Karloff sort of deliberately implies.
Right. It sounds very exotic and vaguely threatening, but he was actually born William Henry Pratt in London in 1887.
1887, right in the thick of the Victorian era.
Exactly. And he came from an Anglo-Indian family, which is a crucial detail that often gets overlooked in his biographies. His father, Edward John Pratt, worked in the Indian Civil Service.
And his mother also had Indian ancestry, right?
Yes, she did. In fact, his mother's maternal aunt was Anna Leonowens.
Wait, really? The Anna Leonowens? From The King and I?
The very same. Her life in the royal court of Siam became the basis for the book and later the musical.
That is wild. I had no idea.
Yeah, so there was already this rich, almost theatrical legacy of traversing different cultures in his bloodline. But growing up in Victorian and Edwardian England, this heritage meant that young William had a relatively dark complexion.
Much darker than his peers, I imagine.
Right. And in the highly stratified, very racially conscious society of late 19th century Britain, that immediately set him apart. He was an outsider from the moment he walked into a schoolroom.
And the hurdles didn't stop there. It's not like he just casually strolled onto a stage and commanded the room from day one.
Not at all. As a young boy, he was bow-legged. He had a profound lisp, and he suffered from a terrible, debilitating stutter.
which is hard to even imagine when you think of his later career.
It took him years of painful effort to learn how to manage the stutter, but that famous lisp, that soft, slightly hissing sibilance, that remained with him for his entire life.
Which is an incredible psychological triumph when you really think about it. The voice that eventually defined horror for an entire generation was, technically speaking, a speech impediment.
He didn't let it defeat him. Instead, he leaned into it. He weaponized that lisp to create this atmosphere of eerie, unnatural calm.
But it took a very long time for the world to hear that voice. Before he ever reached a microphone, he lived a remarkably grueling, punishing life.
Yeah, around 1911, he realized he wasn't going to make it in the diplomatic service like his brothers, so he literally flipped a coin and ended up going to Canada.
And the reality of his time in Canada is just staggering. I think we often romanticize the struggling actor phase, you know? Picture someone waiting tables in a warm cafe in New York.
William Henry Pratt wasn't waiting tables.
No. To make ends meet between these incredibly sparse theatrical stock company gigs, he was doing brutal manual labor. Archival logs and employment records show he spent a year working for the BC Electric Railway Company.
And you have to think about the physical reality of Western Canada in the early 1910s. The winters are just unforgiving. The ground freezes solid.
And here's this young man, raised in the relative comfort of a British civil service family, standing out in the freezing mud, swinging a pickaxe.
He was laying track. He was digging literal ditches. He was shoveling coal and clearing timber.
For $2.50 a day. I mean, that wasn't just hard work. It was survival by the skin of his teeth.
Exactly. And that heavy, punishing labor had permanent consequences. It absolutely destroyed his back. He suffered from severe spinal issues for the rest of his life because of it.
Which makes everything that came later so much more painful.
Yeah, in fact, when World War I broke out shortly after, he tried to enlist in the British Army, but he was rejected. His health was so compromised by the physical toll of the railway work that they wouldn't take him.
He was quite literally a starving artist, hauling plaster and digging in the dirt just to keep breathing.
Which naturally brings us to that legendary turning point in Hollywood. Yeah. Because he eventually makes his way down the West Coast, getting these tiny, uncredited bit parts in silent films.
Right, and because of his darker complexion, studios totally typecast him. He's playing unnamed Arab characters or Native Americans in the background of scenes.
He is getting nowhere. He is aging, he is in chronic pain, and he is broke.
And then one day, he's sitting at a bus stop in Los Angeles, and it is pouring rain, just classic noir weather.
And a car drives by, stops, and the driver offers him a ride. And that driver happens to be Lon Chaney Sr.
The man of 1,000 faces. The absolute reigning king of silent film, horror, and character acting. It's like something out of a movie itself.
It really is. And Lon Chaney Sr. gives this soaking wet, discouraged ditch digger a piece of advice that alters the trajectory of cinematic history.
What did he tell him?
Chaney looks at him and says, find something different that will set you apart. Find something different from anything someone else has done or is willing to do and do it better.
Wow, that is a masterclass in branding before the concept even existed.
Exactly. Chaney was basically telling him not to try to be the handsome leading man, but to find the fringes, find the grotesque, the extreme, and master it.
And Pratt took that to heart. He officially changed his professional name to Boris Karloff.
Right, he chose Boris because it sounded exotic and vaguely threatening, and Karloff supposedly came from a distant family name.
Though years later, his own daughter, Sarah Karloff, admitted with a laugh that there were absolutely no Slavic forebears anywhere in the family tree.
Not at all. He simply needed a name that stood out on a marquee.
And it still took time. He was 44 years old. He had acted in 81 films, most of them completely forgotten today, before director James Whale finally cast him as the monster in Universal's Frankenstein in 1931.
A role that, ironically, demanded he endure even more physical torture.
Oh, the makeup.
The monster makeup designed by Jack Pierce was agonizing to apply and remove, but worse was the costume itself. Karloff had to wear these 4-inch platform boots designed for asphalt layers.
Good grief.
They weighed 11 pounds each. He had steel struts placed along his legs to stiffen his walk. This entirely aggravated the existing back problems he had from his ditch-digging days in Canada.
He was acting through a haze of immense physical agony. So, okay, well, let's unpack this for a second. Karloff is like the ultimate haunted house that turns out to be a magnificent library once you step inside.
That's a great way to put it.
How did his innate gentleness actually make his monsters more terrifying? Because they really are.
It's a profound question, and I think the answer lies in the psychological contrast. If a monster is just a screaming, raging, one-dimensional brute, it's scary in a very primitive way, sure.
Like an animal attack.
Exactly. It's easy for the human mind to distance itself from it because it's just an animal. But Karloff didn't play animals.
Right.
Because he was so inherently gentle and intelligent in his real life, he infused his monsters with a soul. He played them as tragic figures who were acutely aware of their own monstrousness.
When Karloff spoke softly, when he sounded reasonable or profoundly sad about the terrible things he was doing, it bypassed your brain's natural threat detectors.
Yes. That intimacy, that quiet, lisping, hypnotic voice pulling you into the dark is far more unsettling because it feels like a dark secret being shared by a friend.
It's not a monster attacking you. It's a monster confiding in you. Karloff's voice was like a sonic Trojan horse.
A Trojan horse is the perfect analogy.
You hear that cultured, gentle tone, and you let your guard down. And by the time you realize you're sitting in the room with the killer, it's too late.
And you really see that brilliant, cultured mind shine through in a piece of audio from 1941. It's an appearance on a radio quiz show called Information, Please.
Oh, this is one of my favorite artifacts. This is one of the most revealing moments of his entire career.
Information, Please was a highly intellectual panel show. You had literary critics, journalists, historians.
And here sits Boris Karloff, the man who makes his living scaring children in darkened movie houses.
The quizmaster starts firing incredibly dense, obscure literary questions at the panel. And Karloff doesn't just hold his own, he completely commands the room.
Right, the host asks him to identify a specific scene from literature based on a really vague quote. Karloff instantly recognizes it. But he doesn't just answer the trivia question like a normal person.
No, he launches into this flawless, intensely emotional recitation from the 19th century sensation novel East Lynne.
He leans into the microphone and says, "May he so deal with you as I fully and freely forgive you. May he bless you and take you to his rest in heaven. Farewell, my once dear husband, until eternity."
And the delivery is so breathtaking, so full of genuine heartbreak, that the entire studio just goes dead silent.
You can actually hear the hush over the airwaves. The host actually has to break the silence and says, on the air, "I'd like to inform the audience Mr. Adams is broken down completely. I wonder how you can say it through your tears, Mr. Karloff."
He made a room full of hardened New York intellectuals weep openly.
It reveals the erudite, literary soul of the man. Throughout that broadcast, he was quoting Edgar Allan Poe, casually quoting Lewis Carroll from memory.
He was identifying the real-life historical murders that inspired obscure 19th century novels. He wasn't a lumbering brute. He was a deeply read, deeply feeling English gentleman.
Which makes comparing him to his contemporaries so fascinating. If you look at the other titans of horror from that era, Bela Lugosi, Peter Lorre, Lon Chaney Jr., Vincent Price.
And Karloff collaborated with all of them at some point.
He did. But his presence was fundamentally different. Like, Lugosi leaned into this intense, hypnotic, almost predatory theatricality.
And Vincent Price, whom I absolutely adore, was often wonderfully campy. He would arch an eyebrow and chew the scenery with absolute delight.
Oh, nobody chewed scenery like Price. And then you have Peter Lorre, who brought this manic, sweating, neurotic energy to every frame. But
Karloff brought a solemn dignity.
Dignity is exactly the word. Dignity is what separated him.
And if we look at how his early struggles forged that dignity, the pattern becomes really clear. The isolation of being a darker complexioned child in a rigid society. The embarrassment of the stutter.
The years of literal back-breaking poverty in the Canadian winter.
The physical agony of the Frankenstein boots. All that pain, which would have made a lesser man bitter or cynical, gave Karloff a profound sense of empathy.
It gave him a vulnerability and a heavy melancholy that naturally seeped into his performances. He made the horrific emotionally believable because he grounded it in real human suffering.
And that innate gentleness didn't just stay on the movie screen. When he transitioned heavily into radio, where he couldn't rely on his imposing physical stature or the makeup, he had to build that same tragic dread using nothing but a microphone.
Just a microphone and the architecture of a soundstage. Tonight, we continue our journey into the shadows as we step into the creaking orchestral world of vintage radio.
Let's look at the actual mechanics of how this audio horror was constructed, because the craftsmanship of old radio production is practically a lost art form.
It is entirely a lost art. To appreciate what Karloff was doing on shows like Lights Out, Inner Sanctum Mysteries, and Creeps by Night, you really have to understand the environment of the old CBS and NBC studios.
There was no visual safety net. In a film, the director shows you the monster, your brain categorizes it, and in a way, the fear diminishes because the unknown is now known.
You can see the zipper on the suit, so to speak.
Right. But in radio, the monster is built entirely out of sound and the listener's own deepest, most personal fears.
The Foley artists, the sound effects teams, they were absolute magicians. You have to picture these massive sound effects rooms. They had miniature wooden doors and frames just to create the sound of a creaking tomb.
They had boxes of different grades of gravel and cornstarch so an artist could march in place and make it sound like footsteps fleeing through snow or crunching down a dirt road.
They used snapped celery stalks for breaking bones. They had massive canvas wind machines.
And right there in the studio, a live orchestra with a conductor watching the clock, waiting to drop a massive musical stinger right on the punchline of a scare.
And Karloff had to conduct his vocal performance in perfect synchronization with all of this chaos.
Let's examine a specific episode of Lights Out from July 1947 called Death Robbery. It is a masterclass in building auditory tension.
Oh, this one is so good. Karloff plays a character named Dr. David. He is a brilliant research scientist whose beloved wife Ruth has tragically died.
And he is so consumed by his grief, so fundamentally broken, that he decides to use his latest invention, a modification of the cathode ray that he calls the theta ray, to bring her back to life.
Now, I want to pause on the theta ray for a second because the way the script handles the science fiction exposition is brilliant. It doesn't just say he has a magic machine.
No, it gets surprisingly technical.
He brings in his closest friend, a surgeon named Ed, to assist him. And Dr. David walks Ed through the laboratory explaining the empirical data. He says he successfully tested this theta ray on animals exactly 714 times.
He has the data, but Ed is absolutely horrified. Ed tells David he is usurping the powers of God Almighty.
And David responds with this chillingly calm, rational tone. He says, "My dear Ed, you can't stop scientific progress because of a so-called moral concept."
He refers to the experiment as death robbery. He says they are literally going to rob Old Man Death.
He has reduced the profound spiritual boundary between life and death to a mere mechanical problem to be solved.
The ethical debate between them is riveting. Ed asks him the ultimate question. What if you bring her back without her soul?
And David, playing the pure empiricist, completely dismisses the concept of a soul. He tells Ed to focus on the sphygmomanometer readings, focus on the injections of adrenaline,
Focus on the voltage of the theta ray. It's pure mechanics to him.
which sets up the audio sequence of the resurrection, which is a triumph of Foley art and pacing.
You hear the relentless clinical reading of the blood pressure dropping to 0.
You hear the deep, rising, oscillating hum of the theta ray machine, probably created by a manipulated audio oscillator building in pitch.
You hear the tension of the men breathing, and then the absolute silence, and then the ragged intake of breath from the corpse.
But the horror doesn't come from the resurrection itself. It comes the moment she fully wakes up. She doesn't speak his name. She doesn't speak at all.
She unleashes this animalistic, horrific scream.
And through the sound design, we realize she is entirely mindless. She is operating on pure homicidal instinct. You hear the rustle of clothing, the clatter of surgical instruments.
She gets her hands on a scalpel. She murders Ed right there in the laboratory.
And the episode ends with this devastating realization from Dr. David. He has brought back a soulless, violent shell, and it is now hunting him in the dark of his own home.
His final line is, "May God forgive us." It is a classic tragedy of hubris, the yearning of a broken heart overriding the natural order of the universe.
And what makes it so powerful is that Karloff doesn't play Dr. David as a cackling, mustache-twirling villain.
Not at all. He plays him as a desperate, deeply loving husband who makes a catastrophic, universe-breaking mistake. You feel sorry for him right up until the scalpel drops.
But here is where the reality of American post-war radio culture hits you like a truck, because you have this devastating, emotionally exhausting Gothic morality play, and then immediately, without taking a breath, the studio announcer cuts in with a jingle.
Listen to the sweetest shaving song ever written. Push, pull, click, click. Changes blades that quick with the ever-sharp Schick injector razor.
It is deeply jarring to modern ears. It's this bizarre whiplash between existential terror and cheerful post-war consumerism.
You see it even more starkly in the Inner Sanctum Mysteries episode, The Wailing Wall.
Oh, Inner Sanctum is an absolute trip. For those who haven't heard it, every episode opens with the iconic sound of a painfully squeaking door slowly swinging open.
And the host, a character named Raymond, delivers these morbidly cheerful, pun-filled monologues about death.
In The Wailing Wall, Karloff plays a man named Gabriel Hornell. Gabriel lives in a massive mansion, and he's being nagged endlessly by his supposedly invalid wife, Agnes.
The auditory design really establishes how her voice grates on him.
It does. He finally snaps, strangles her, and in a direct homage to Edgar Allan Poe, he literally bricks her body up inside the basement wall.
It's very much a blend of The Cask of Amontillado and The Telltale Heart.
Precisely. But after the masonry is finished and the wet plaster dries, he starts hearing this horrific, high-pitched wailing echoing from inside the wall.
He becomes convinced his wife is still alive there, slowly suffocating. It drives him absolutely mad.
He calls the police himself in a panic. The police show up, they listen, but they tell him it's just the wind in the old pipes. But the wailing continues.
Finally, the twist drops. Gabriel is informed by the authorities that his wife's body was actually discovered down by the river.
It turns out she wasn't dead when he choked her. She woke up, wandered out of the house in a daze, and drowned. So Gabriel realizes, with dawning absolute terror, what did he brick up alive inside the wall in the dark?
It was the cat.
It was the cat. The howling was the family cat slowly dying behind the bricks. And Gabriel is so overwhelmed by the sheer grotesque madness of it all that he throws himself out of an 18-story hospital window.
It is pure, unadulterated pulp terror.
But again, the moment he hits the pavement, the squeaking door opens and the host, Raymond, cuts in. He starts joking with a cheerful commercial spokeswoman named Mary about whistling tea kettles, seamlessly pivoting to a pitch for Lipton noodle soup and Lipton tea's brisk flavor.
If you want a sunny disposition, try relaxing with a cup of Lipton tea. It's utterly absurd.
Why did sponsors insist on this?
I think they knew that the horror they were broadcasting into people's living rooms was genuinely traumatizing, and they needed to break the unbearable tension with the most mundane, comforting reality possible.
Hot soup and a good shave.
Exactly. But this raises an important question about the medium itself. Why did horror flourish so uniquely well in radio, and why does modern media often fail to capture the specific kind of atmosphere?
In the late 1940s, families gathered around these glowing wooden cabinets. The darkness of their own homes became the canvas.
Radio horror weaponized the listener's own imagination. When Karloff heard the wailing in the wall, the listener naturally looked at the shadows on their own living room walls.
I completely agree with the power of the imagination, but I have to push back a little here. With the Lipton tea ads, the squeaking doors, the over-the-top screaming, wasn't a lot of this just cheap thrills.
You think it was just fast food entertainment?
Essentially, yes. Fast food entertainment for the ears. I mean, a cat in the wall is a great jump scare, but is it high art?
What's fascinating here is the contrast between American pulp radio and British Gothic traditions. I understand why it feels like fast food entertainment on the surface. The commercial reps are certainly gaudy.
Very gaudy.
But I would vigorously push back on the idea that the core stories were just cheap thrills. Underneath the commercialism, these scripts functioned as essential modern morality plays. Let's look at another Inner Sanctum episode, Death for Sale. This completely refutes the cheap thrill argument.
Okay, that's the one where Karloff plays a man named Mark Davis. Walk me through the morality play aspect of it.
Mark and his wife Cora enter into a conspiracy with a man named Elliot. They stage a car crash to fake Elliot's death.
Yep.
They then have to wait the legally required 7 years for Elliot to be officially declared dead in absentia, at which point they plan to split a massive $50,000 life insurance payout.
So they wait the 7 years, they endure the anxiety, the poverty.
But just days before the payout is approved, Elliot returns. He's tired of hiding, and he demands a larger cut of the money. And then, to make matters worse, Elliot's secret second wife shows up and begins blackmailing Mark and Cora.
And Mark, driven by the sunk cost fallacy of waiting 7 years, ends up murdering both Elliot and the second wife to protect the investment. He refuses to let the money go.
The greed completely overrides his humanity.
Exactly.
But it's the ending that elevates it from a cheap thriller to a tragedy. As Mark and Cora are finally driving to the insurance office to collect the check they have literally killed for, the guilt violently overtakes Cora.
She goes mad in the passenger seat, grabs the steering wheel, and crashes the car. Cora dies instantly.
Mark survives the crash, but loses the money, his wife, and eventually he loses his own life on the gallows when the murders are exposed.
The structure of that narrative is a straight line back to G.K. Chesterton and Poe.
It's the philosophical idea that sin inevitably consumes the sinner. The universe demands balance. The universe will not allow you to profit from the destruction of another human soul.
And Karloff's gravitas, his weary desperation, elevates that script from a pulp crime story to a heavy, tragic morality play.
I see your point. The consequences are deeply internal. While the supernatural elements are thrilling, the true terror always comes back to something deeply flawed human.
Which leads us to a bit of a disagreement between you and me tonight. Because while you prefer the moral, psychological breakdowns, I am drawn to something much more primal.
We are looking at the two distinct flavors of Karloff's radio work, the psychological thriller versus the supernatural Gothic.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The sheer auditory terror of a wolf howl echoing out of a vintage radio speaker. That is my absolute favorite flavor of Karloff.
You're referring to his work on the series Creeps by Night?
Yes. This is where I think radio horror reaches its absolute peak. You can have your insurance fraud and your guilty consciences. I am a sucker for the foggy swamps. I want the howling wolves. I want the sheer visceral dread of the supernatural dripping out of the AM dial.
Specifically episodes like The Walking Dead and The Hunt.
Exactly. Let's talk about The Walking Dead. This episode takes us out of the polite living rooms and drops us onto an isolated coffee plantation in Haiti.
The sound design in that one is oppressive.
It is. You have the constant rhythmic beating of native drums in the background. The Foley artist created this sultry, suffocating night atmosphere. A cruel overseer named LaRue dies, but the locals use voodoo chants to bring him back.
And the visual we are forced to imagine is terrifying.
They describe seeing him running through the dark 3 hours after he was pronounced dead, his skin ghostly white, his lips blue, completely silent. It's pure atmospheric dread. It bypasses the intellect and hits the nervous system.
The atmosphere is undeniably effective, and The Hunt shifts that specific flavor of dread from Haiti to the Louisiana bayou.
Picture an isolated, rotting farmhouse on the edge of the swamp. You have the constant whine of bloodhounds straining at their leashes, the deep croak of bullfrogs, the cicadas.
And there's a local legend of a werewolf slaughtering livestock.
Karloff plays Horton, a very stern man who keeps his sister, Julie, locked inside the house. He tells everyone it's for her own good that she's unwell.
But the local investigators hear this unearthly howling from the swamp.
They take their flashlights into the cypress grove, the dogs are going crazy, and their beams of light land on an animal with a human face. It turns out Horton knew all along his sister was the monster.
The auditory terror of that wolf howl, layered with Karloff's tragic realization that he can't protect her anymore.
To me, that is the pinnacle of his work. It's the fear of the monstrous unknown lurking just past the edge of the firelight.
I hear what you're saying, and I won't deny that the Foley work on those episodes is spectacular. The swamp feels wet and dangerous, but I have to gently disagree that it's his best work. Yeah. I think Karloff's greatest performances and the truest horror aren't supernatural at all. A Werewolf in Louisiana is scary, but it's fundamentally escapist. The truest horror is psychological. It's the moral horror of everyday life.
You're pulling out the heavy literature to prove this one, but isn't that just depressing? I want to be scared, not reminded of the crushing weight of a mortgage and a bad marriage.
It might be depressing, but it's far more resonant. Let's look at the NBC University Theater production of H.G. Wells's The History of Mr. Polly. This was a prestigious, full-hour dramatization.
And Karloff plays the title role.
Right. Mr. Polly isn't a werewolf. He isn't a mad scientist with a theta ray. He is a 35-year-old, slightly plump, thoroughly depressed shopkeeper in a dingy gray English town called Fishbourne.
He suffers from terrible chronic indigestion. He hates his failing shop. He hates his neighbors.
He fundamentally resents the cold pork his wife feeds him every night. There's a moment where he sits on a stile in the strong, biting east wind, looks at his life, and says, "Rotten silly wheeze of an owl, how'd I ever get into this hole?"
The misery is suffocating. He is drowning in the utterly mundane.
Precisely. It is the horror of being trapped in an ordinary, loveless life that is far more relatable and devastating to the average listener than a voodoo curse. The terror is waking up and realizing you have wasted your existence.
So Mr. Polly becomes so overwhelmed by this realization that he decides the only logical way out is to kill himself.
He hatches a plan to slit his own throat and burn his shop down simultaneously so his wife can at least collect the fire insurance.
But the tragedy turns into a farce because he completely fumbles the suicide. It's just wild to think about. He accidentally sets his own trousers on fire before he can use the razor.
He runs out into the street screaming, his pants ablaze.
And in the ensuing chaos, he inadvertently saves the lives of his elderly neighbors who were trapped by the spreading fire. He accidentally becomes a local hero.
And in the aftermath of that chaotic, fiery failure, he realizes a profound philosophical truth. H.G. Wells writes the narration beautifully. When once a man has broken through the paper walls of everyday circumstance, he has made a discovery. If the world does not please you, you can change it.
The fire burns away his obligations, so Mr. Pauly doesn't rebuild. He just walks away.
He leaves his wife, his town, his old life, and becomes a tramp wandering the country roads. And he eventually finds true peace working as a simple ferryman at a riverside pub called the Potwell Inn.
Though he does have to fight a terrifying, violent local thug named Uncle Jim with a broom to maintain that peace. I love that scene. He discovers his courage with a sweeping brush.
True, but the thematic point remains. Karloff plays this pathetic, weary, dyspeptic, ultimately triumphant little man with such immense, overflowing empathy.
He proves he doesn't need fangs or spells or glowing dials to captivate an audience. He just needs human frailty. He takes the listener by the hand and walks them out of their own despair.
And that deep understanding of human frailty is also what made him incredibly, surprisingly funny.
We absolutely have to talk about his comedic range, because it shows how entirely self-aware he was about his own image. In 1941, he took a massive risk and starred on Broadway in a comedy called Arsenic and Old Lace.
It wasn't just a hit, it was a phenomenon. It ran for 1,444 performances.
The legendary theater critic Richard Lockridge reviewed it and called the play a noisy, preposterous, incoherent joy. And Karloff plays Jonathan Brewster.
Jonathan is a homicidal maniac who travels the world murdering people, and he has recently had back-alley plastic surgery to hide his face from the international police.
But the running gag of the entire play is that the drunken plastic surgeon botched the job. He was watching a horror movie during the operation, and now Jonathan Brewster looks exactly like Boris Karloff.
And Jonathan is absolutely furious about it. He flies into a murderous rage every single time someone points out the resemblance.
It's brilliant avant-garde metacomedy. He is literally on a Broadway stage parodying the terrifying aura of Boris Karloff.
And he brought that exact same deadpan self-awareness to radio comedy. He was a frequent, highly requested guest on major comedy programs.
There's a transcript from the Jack Benny show that is just pure gold. Jack Benny is doing his usual routine, trying to light a cigarette, and Karloff just silently materializes next to him.
The studio audience goes wild. Benny acts startled and says, "You know, you look so much like Boris Karloff."
And Karloff, leaning into the microphone with that perfectly polite, cultured, lisping voice, says, "My resemblance to Mr. Karloff is purely physical. For instance, I would never think of going to a cemetery in the black of night, opening graves and stealing the gold teeth out of dead bodies. Dishonest, you know."
It's hilarious because he delivers it with the sincerity of an Oxford professor.
And then later in the sketch, he casually offers to buy Jack Benny's cigarette lighter for $20,000. He just drops a $20,000 bill on the table like he's buying a newspaper.
His comedic timing is flawless. He knew exactly how the audience perceived him, and he knew exactly how to playfully subvert those expectations without ever breaking character.
Which brings us to the core truth of his 50-year career. Whether he was playing a ruthless killer, a resurrected zombie, a weary English shopkeeper, or the deadpan butt of a joke on the Jack Benny program, Boris Karloff always infused his characters with a profound sense of sadness and restraint.
And nowhere in the surviving archives is that more evident or more devastating than in the performance we are looking at next.
Somewhere out beyond the Missouri River, the wind is kicking up a notch against the studio glass. The coffee is running low. And we are moving into the final chapter of our broadcast tonight, Borrowed Time and the Beauty of the Vanishing Age.
We want to focus deeply on a specific broadcast produced by the Armed Forces Radio Service. It is a 1-hour dramatization of the stage play on Borrowed Time, originally written by Paul Osborne.
If you listen to nothing else from the Karloff archives, listen to this. It is without a doubt one of the most emotional, finely tuned performances of his entire career.
He doesn't play a villain. He doesn't play a monster or a madman. He plays a character simply called Gramps.
Gramps is a fiercely loving, fiercely stubborn, foul-mouthed old man who lives with his young grandson, Pud.
The setup of the play is inherently tragic. Gramps is raising young Pud because the boy's parents were killed in a car accident. They are all each other has left in the world.
But there is a very human antagonist circling them. Aunt Demetria. She is a cruel, rigid, deeply greedy woman who wants to take legal custody of Pud.
She doesn't love the boy. She just wants to get her hands on the $15,000 inheritance that Pud's father left in trust for him.
Gramps absolutely despises her. The dialogue is so sharp he constantly insults her, calling her a bird stuffer and a pious old battle axe right to her face.
But Gramps is feeling his age. His heart is failing. He's tired. And one afternoon, a polite, immaculately dressed man named Mr. Brink shows up at the front gate.
Mr. Brink is the personification of death. He doesn't carry a scythe, he carries a ledger.
He tells Gramps politely that it is time for him to go to where the woodbine twineth, which is Gramps' personal, poetic euphemism for the afterlife.
But Gramps realizes the terrible truth. If he goes with Mr. Brink, if he dies today, and Demetria gets custody of Pud, he cannot leave the boy to that fate.
So, utilizing a magical wish he was previously granted for doing a good deed for a stranger, Gramps decides to trick death.
The magical wish stipulated that anyone who climbs the old apple tree in Gramps' front yard is physically stuck in the branches until Gramps gives them explicit permission to come down.
So Gramps cons Mr. Brink into climbing the tree to fetch a particularly juicy apple, and suddenly, death is trapped in the branches.
It is a brilliant folkloric premise, and because death is trapped in a tree in a suburban front yard, no one in the entire world can die. Gramps has literally suspended human mortality to protect his grandson.
The local physician, Dr. Evans, thinks Gramps has lost his mind and tries to have him committed to an insane asylum.
But Gramps proves the impossible reality of the situation by having the doctor try to kill a housefly with a massive dose of horse poison. The fly drinks the poison and just buzzes away happily. Nothing can die.
It sounds like a whimsical, almost comedic setup, but the climax of the play is utterly devastating, because the universe demands balance.
Young Pud, trying to prove to Gramps and Aunt Demetria that he isn't a baby anymore, tries to climb the high wooden fence in the yard. He slips and falls, and his spine is shattered.
Dr. Evans examines the boy and delivers the horrific news. Pud will never walk again. He's permanently paralyzed, and he is in terrible, unceasing pain.
But because death is in the tree, the boy cannot find the release of passing away. He is trapped in agony.
And this is where Karloff's performance transcends everything else we've discussed tonight. The silence between his lines is heavier than the dialogue.
Gramps realizes that his hubris, his desperate desire to protect the boy by trapping death, hasn't stopped suffering. It has only prolonged it.
The entire world is bewildered and in agony because hospitals are full of the dying who cannot pass on. The natural release, the mercy of death, is gone.
And worst of all, the grandson he sacrificed the natural order for is broken and hurting.
So Gramps walks out to the yard and talks to Mr. Brink up in the branches. He asks a quiet question. He asks if Mr. Brink can take them both at the same time.
And Mr. Brink says yes. He only needs to touch them.
Gramps makes the hardest choice a human being can make. He gives the formal order to let Mr. Brink down from the tree.
And the moment Death's feet touch the grass, the pain vanishes. Pud sits up and says, "I feel like a 2-year-old."
And Gramps, feeling his failing heart suddenly light and free, says, "I feel like a 2-year-old too."
And the final exchange between Karloff and the child actor playing Pud is guaranteed to bring tears to your eyes. The boy looks up and asks, "Where are we going, Gramps?"
And Karloff, with that gentle, lisping, endlessly tender voice, replies, "Don't you remember where the woodbine twineth?"
How long will we be there?
Over eternity.
How long is eternity, Gramps?
Right, smart piece of time, boy. Anyway, we'll be there together, won't we?
It is breathtakingly tender. It ruins me every time I hear it.
It perfectly encapsulates Boris Karloff's greatest power as an artist. His defining trait wasn't monstrosity, it was vulnerability. He spent his entire career portraying characters who stood on the boundary between life and death.
In Frankenstein, he was dragged violently from death into life against his will.
In Lights Out, he arrogantly dragged his wife across that boundary with a machine.
In Inner Sanctum, he sent innocent people across it out of greed.
But here, as Gramps, he willingly, lovingly steps across the boundary himself just to hold a frightened child's hand in the dark. He transforms death from a terror into a friend.
So what does this all mean for us today? Listening to this scratchy, surviving recording of a man who's been gone for decades, it feels like sitting in the back row of a dusty, abandoned theater from another century, watching ghosts perform just for you.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Boris Karloff is one of the last guardians of a vanished age of storytelling. He understood implicitly that the radio microphone was an instrument of profound intimacy.
He didn't have CGI, he didn't have special effects budgets or high-definition screens.
He had his breath, his pacing, his lisp, and the deep well of his own sorrow. His voice didn't just tell a story. It reached out of the speaker into the dark living room and held the listener's hand.
He demanded that the audience collaborate with him. He provided the emotional truth, but the audience had to use their own imagination to paint the sets, cast the shadows, and build the monsters in their own minds.
We've traveled a long way on the dial tonight, from the eerie, bricked-up wailing walls of Inner Sanctum to the voodoo drums and claustrophobic Louisiana swamps of Creeps by Night.
We've laughed with him at Jack Benny's expense, and we've sat quietly under the apple tree of on-borrowed time, waiting for Mr. Brink.
We've discovered a man who dug ditches in the frozen Canadian mud for $2.50 a day, who endured lifelong, excruciating physical pain just to stand in front of a camera.
But who possessed a remarkable intelligence, dignity, and melancholy. A man who could read a Victorian poem about forgiveness and make a room full of hardened New York intellectuals weep openly on live radio.
There is an immense, lonely beauty to listening to the radio after midnight. These broadcasts survived through time, trapped on delicate transcription discs and magnetic tape, preserving not just a single voice, but an entire era of human imagination.
They remind us of a time when families didn't stare at separate screens. They turned out the lamps, stared at the glowing amber dial together, and let their minds wander into the terrifying, thrilling unknown.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. In our current era of blinding, high-definition screens, constant notifications, and infinite visual stimuli, have we lost the sacred, terrifying art of listening to the dark?
We don't have to imagine the monsters anymore. They are rendered for us in flawless 4K resolution by computers. Everything is shown, leaving nothing to the mind.
But what happens to our own internal landscapes when we stop using them? What happens to the muscle of imagination when it is never exercised by the unseen?
If Boris Karloff were to speak from the shadows of your room right now, whispering softly with that gentle lisp, what would your imagination conjure? Thank you for staying awake with us tonight. From our late-night studio here at Chesterton Radio in Atchison, Kansas, as the wind finally begins to settle across the plains, keep your lamps low and your imagination running. Good night.